The dust devil swept across the barren field like a ghost searching for something it would never find. Maffeo Castellano stood on the sagging porch of his ranch house, squinting through the haze of another bone-dry Texas afternoon. The thermometer, nailed to the post, read 107 degrees, but the bank notices in his back pocket felt hotter than hell itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months. That's all the time he had left before Lone Star Bank came to collect what remained of the Castellanos' legacy. 4 generations of his family had worked this land, carved a life from the unforgiving earth of Brewster County, and now it would all disappear because the rains had stopped coming. And the cattle had started dying. He pulled the brim of his Stetson lower and walked toward the old water pump beside the barn. The handle groaned like an arthritic joint as he worked it, producing nothing but a few rusty drops that disappeared into the cracked earth before they could even darken the soil. The well had run dry 2 weeks ago, same as the Martinez spread. To the east and the Thompson place up north, the whole county was dying of thirst. Maffeo's boots crunched on the sun-baked ground as he surveyed what was left of his herd. 11 heads of cattle clustered in whatever shade they could find beneath the skeletal mesquite trees. Last spring, he had 43. The drought had taken some, the bank loan had forced him to sell others, and now what remained looked like walking advertisements for failure. The silence out here wasn't peaceful, it was the silence of things slowly dying. No birds sang because there were no trees healthy enough to hold nests. No insects buzzed because there were no flowers to feed. Even the wind seemed tired, barely stirring the brown grass that used to be green pasture. He climbed into his ancient Ford pickup, the one with more rust than paint and a passenger door that wouldn't open. The engine turned over on the 4th try, coughing black smoke into the cloudless sky. Today was supply run day, which meant driving 40 miles to Marfa for the essentials he could still afford: beans, coffee, ammunition for the rifle he kept hoping he wouldn't need to use on himself. The road to town was a ribbon of cracked asphalt that shimmered like water in the distance. Another cruel joke in a land that hadn't seen real water in 8 months. Maffeo had driven this route thousands of times, knew every pothole and curve, but today something felt different. There was a tension in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes, though there wasn't a cloud anywhere to be seen. He passed the abandoned Sinclair gas station, where he'd bought his first beer at 16, back when old man Sinclair would look the other way if you had enough change and looked desperate enough. The pumps stood like tombstones now, their screens dark and their hoses coiled like dead snakes. Further down the road, the Riverside Motel sat empty and forgotten, its neon sign spelling out vacancy in flickering letters that hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. Maffeo remembered when that place stayed busy with tourists heading to Big Bend National Park. Now the only visitors were tumbleweeds and the occasional coyote looking for somewhere cool to die. The general store in Marfa was one of the few businesses still breathing, though barely. Mrs. Chun behind the counter looked up when the bells above the door announced his arrival, her weathered face creasing into what might have been a smile if smiles came easier in drought country. "Afternoon, Maffeo," she said, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who'd seen too many good men broken by circumstances beyond their control. "Hot enough for you." "Could be hotter," he replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. He gathered his supplies without much conversation: a bag of pinto beans, a can of coffee that would have to last 2 weeks, a box of ammunition for the .30-06 that used to hunt deer but now mainly kept coyotes away from what remained of his livestock. At the register, Mrs. Chun counted out his change with fingers that moved slowly, deliberately. "Maffeo," she said quietly, "my husband heard something at the hardware store about your place." He nodded. Bad news travels fast in small towns. especially when it involves land that had been in one family for nearly a century. Banks have 90 days to make their money back, or they take everything. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Your grandfather was a good man. Used to give us credit when times were hard, never asked for interest." Matthew pocketed the change and touched the brim of his hat. "Times change, Mrs. Chun, not always for the better." The drive back to the ranch felt longer than usual, though the speedometer needle stayed steady at 55. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if they didn't remind him of fire. Everything out here looked like it was burning, even when it WASN single quotes D. He was halfway home when he saw the smoke, not the thin, hazy smoke of heat waves rising from superheated ground, but real smoke, black and thick, rising from somewhere near his property line. Matthew pressed the accelerator harder than the old Ford appreciated, and the engine responded with a reluctant surge of power. The smoke was coming from the direction of Devil's Canyon, a deep cut in the earth about 2 miles from his house, where flash floods used to carve channels through solid rock, back when flash floods were still possible. Now it was just another dry scar on the landscape, filled with nothing but rattlesnakes and regret. As he got closer, he could see the source of the smoke, a vehicle, or what was left of one. A white sedan, probably 10 years old, had gone off the ranch road and rolled down into the canyon. The wreckage was still smoldering, its windows blown out and its roof caved in like a crushed beer can. Matthew parked his truck at the edge of the canyon and grabbed the fire extinguisher from behind his seat. The descent into Devil's Canyon was treacherous on a good day, loose rocks and hidden crevices that could snap an ankle without warning. Today, with smoke reducing visibility and the metal wreckage still hot enough to cook meat, it felt like climbing down into hell itself. The car had rolled at least 3 times before coming to rest against a boulder the size of a small house. The front end was completely destroyed, the engine block visible through what used to be the windshield. Steam hissed from the radiator, and the acrid smell of burning oil mixed with something else, something that made Matthew's stomach clench with dread. He circled the wreckage carefully, looking for survivors, though logic told him no one could have walked away from this kind of destruction. The driver's side door had been torn completely off during the roll, and the interior was a chaos of shattered glass, twisted metal, and scattered belongings. That's when he heard it, not a scream, or a groan, or any of the sounds he might have expected from an accident scene. It was crying, the thin, desperate wailing of a baby. Multiple babies. Matthew's heart hammered against his ribs as he moved around to the back of the vehicle. The trunk had popped open during the crash, spilling its contents across the rocky ground. Suitcases, clothes, a cooler that had burst open, and scattered ice that was already melting in the brutal heat. And there, nestled against the rear bumper in a makeshift shelter created by a fallen piece of luggage, was a wooden crate. Not a proper baby carrier or car seat, but an actual wooden crate, the kind used for shipping fruit or vegetables. Someone had lined it with blankets and pillows, creating a crude but effective cushion that had somehow protected its precious cargo during the violent tumble down the canyon wall. Inside the crate were 3 babies, triplets, by the look of them, probably no more than 6 months old. 2 girls and a boy, all 3 crying with the particular urgency that comes from hunger, thirst, and fear. They were dressed in simple white onesies that were now stained with dirt and soot, but they appeared to be uninjured, a miracle that defied every law of physics Matthew could think of. He knelt beside the crate, his hands shaking as he reached for the nearest baby, one of the girls, her face red from crying but her eyes bright and alert. She quieted the moment he lifted her, as if recognizing that salvation had arrived in the form of a broken-down rancher who could barely save himself. The other 2 babies continued crying, and Matthew realized he couldn't carry all 3 at once. He looked around the crash site, searching for some clue about where they'd come from or who they belonged to. The license plate was from Oklahoma, and there were enough personal belongings scattered around to suggest this wasn't just a passing traveler, but someone who'd been living out of their car. A purse had been thrown clear of the wreckage, its contents spread across the rocks like pieces of a shattered life. Driver's license, credit cards, photographs, and a folded piece of paper that looked like it might be important. Matthew gathered what he could reach without putting the baby down. Stuffing everything into his shirt pocket, the sun was getting lower, and the temperature in the canyon would drop fast once darkness fell. Out here, the difference between day and night could be 40 degrees, and babies wouldn't survive that kind of cold, especially not babies who'd already been through what these three had endured. Matthew made 3 trips up the canyon wall, carrying one baby at a time in the makeshift crate. Each climb was harder than the last, his legs burning from the effort and his lungs fighting the thin air and lingering smoke. By the time he got all 3 babies secured in the cab of his pickup truck, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his hands were cut from the rough rocks. The drive back to his ranch house felt surreal, like something that was happening to someone else. 3 babies, 3 human lives that had somehow survived a crash that should have killed them, were now his responsibility. He had no formula, no diapers, no idea how to care for infants. He could barely keep himself fed. But as he glanced over at the crate on the passenger seat, where the 3 babies had finally stopped crying and were looking up at him with those impossibly trusting eyes, Matthew felt something he hadn't experienced in months: purpose. The ranch house looked different when he pulled into the driveway. The peeling paint and sagging porch were still there. The dead flower beds and broken fence posts hadn't magically repaired themselves, but somehow the place felt less empty, less like a tomb waiting for its final occupant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He carried the crate inside and set it gently on the kitchen table. The babies stirred, but didn't cry, their small faces peaceful in the dim light filtering through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in longer than Matthew cared to remember. One of the girls, the one he'd picked up first, was looking directly at him, and for a moment he could have sworn she was trying to communicate something beyond the basic needs of hunger and comfort. Matthew had never been around babies. He and his ex-wife Carmen had talked about having children back when they still talked about having a future together. But the ranch had always demanded too much attention, too much money, too much of everything. By the time he'd gotten his priorities straight, Carmen was gone and the possibility of a family had died with their marriage. Now, staring down at 3 tiny faces that represented 3 futures that had been placed entirely in his hands, Matthew Castellanos felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a yoke. These babies needed food, shelter, care, and love, things he wasn't sure he remembered how to provide. But they were alive and they were here. And for the first time in months, the silence of his dying ranch was broken by something other than the wind. The first thing Matthew realized was that babies required more than good intentions and strong hands. Standing in his kitchen at sunset, watching 3 small faces study him with the intensity of tiny judges, he understood that everything he thought he knew about survival was about to be tested in ways he'd never imagined. His refrigerator contained a half-empty bottle of Lone Star beer, some leftover beans from 2 days ago, and a block of cheese that had seen better weeks. The pantry wasn't much more promising: canned goods, instant coffee, and the kind of processed foods that kept a bachelor rancher alive, but wouldn't sustain 3 infants, who looked like they hadn't eaten in hours. The girl who'd caught his attention first began making soft mewing sounds, the kind that suggested patience was wearing thin. Her siblings remained quiet, but their eyes tracked his movements as he searched through kitchen cabinets for anything that might help. In the drawer next to the sink, buried beneath old receipts and broken rubber bands, he found a small glass. Baby bottle, a relic from his nephew's visit 3 years ago when his sister Maria had still been speaking to him. Matthew held the bottle up to the light, surprised to find it intact. Maria had brought little Carlos for a weekend that had stretched into a week when her husband deployed overseas. She'd left bottles and formula and a dozen other baby supplies, most of which Matthew had stored away and forgotten after they'd returned. To El Paso, the storage closet off the kitchen yielded unexpected treasures. 2 more bottles, a package of formula that looked ancient but unopened, and a small stack of diapers that felt like finding gold in a played-out mine. The expiration date on the formula made him pause. 8 months past due, but these babies needed something. And expired formula seemed better than no formula at all. He mixed the powder with lukewarm water from the tap, tasting it first and finding it bland but not obviously spoiled. The girl who'd been making noise opened her mouth eagerly when he brought the bottle close, latching on with the desperate efficiency of someone who understood that survival meant taking what was offered. While she drank, Matthew studied the other 2 babies more carefully. The boy had darker hair than his sisters, and a small birthmark on his left cheek that looked like a crescent moon. One sister had bright blue eyes that seemed too wise for such a young face, while the other's eyes were brown and held a mischievous glint that reminded Matthew of his own childhood photographs. They were beautiful children, healthy despite their ordeal, and the fact that they'd survived the crash seemed more miraculous with each passing minute. Matthew had seen enough car wrecks in his 42 years to know that metal and glass didn't discriminate based on age or innocence. These 3 should have been killed instantly, yet here they were, drinking formula and studying his face like they were trying to memorize it. The purse contents he'd collected from the crash site were spread across the kitchen counter. A Louisiana driver's license belonging to Rebecca Marie Tompkins, age 26, with an address in New Orleans. The photo showed a young woman with tired eyes and prematurely lined face, the kind of wear that came from too much stress and not enough sleep. There were credit cards, all maxed out according to the decline notices stuffed between them. A checkbook, with a register showing a balance of -$43. Photographs of the babies at various stages of their short lives. Some professional portraits, but mostly candid shots taken with a phone camera. In every picture, Rebecca Tompkins looked like she was trying to smile through something heavy and dark. The folded paper turned out to be a hand-drawn map, crude but detailed enough to show the route from Louisiana through Texas to somewhere in New Mexico. Notes were scribbled in the margins: gas stations, cheap motels, places to buy formula and diapers. At the bottom, in handwriting that grew increasingly shaky toward the end, were the words, "Santa Fe Sister Catherine safe. Harbor they'll understand." Matthew turned the paper over and found a letter, written in the same unsteady hand. "If something happens to me, please know that I tried everything else first. My babies deserve better than what I can give them. The father doesn't know they exist, and his family would destroy them if they found out. Sister Catherine at Safe Harbor in Santa Fe promised she would help, but I didn't have enough money for gas to get there. These babies are innocent. They're good. Please don't let them end up in the system like I did. Rebecca," the letter explained. The wooden crate, the desperate journey across state lines, the feeling Matthew had noticed in the air before finding the crash. Rebecca Tompkins had been running towards something she hoped would save her children, and instead had run into tragedy on a forgotten stretch of Texas road. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, a sound that had always comforted Matthew before tonight. Now it made him think of predators circling weakness, and he found himself checking the locks on doors that hadn't been locked in years. These babies made him responsible for more than just his own survival. The girl finished her bottle and fell asleep against his shoulder, her small body warm and trusting in a way that made his chest tight. He'd held his nephew years ago, but Carlos had been walking by then, more interested in exploring than being held. This was different. This was complete dependence, the kind of faith that expected protection without question. He improvised sleeping arrangements using dresser drawers, padded with clean towels, placing all 3 makeshift cribs in his bedroom where he could hear them if they woke during the night. The boy and the quiet sister fell asleep quickly, but the blue-eyed girl remained awake, watching him with an intensity that felt almost supernatural. "What are you thinking about in there?" he whispered, adjusting her blanket. "You wondering who I am, whether I'm going to take care of you?" She blinked slowly, deliberately, and for a moment Matthew could have sworn she understood every word. Then she closed her eyes and joined her siblings in sleep, leaving him alone with thoughts that felt too big for his small bedroom. The ranch house settled around them as temperature dropped and wood contracted, making the creaking sounds that had become the soundtrack of Matthew's solitary existence. But tonight the sounds felt different, less like a building slowly dying and more like a structure adapting to new life within its walls. He walked through rooms that suddenly seemed enormous. The living room with its sagging couch and coffee table covered in unpaid bills. The dining room that hadn't seen a proper meal since Carmen left, its table buried under farm equipment catalogs and livestock magazines. The spare bedroom that had been intended for children who never came, now filled with broken furniture and boxes of memories he couldn't bear to sort through. Everything would need to change. Babies required safety measures he'd never considered electrical. Outlets covered, sharp corners padded, small objects removed from reaching distance. They needed routine, predictability, the kind of structured environment that his bachelor existence had never provided. More immediately, they needed supplies he couldn't afford. Formula and diapers were expensive under normal circumstances, but for triplets, they represented a financial burden that could bankrupt him faster than the bank foreclosure. 3 babies meant 3 times the cost of everything, 3 times the need for attention and care. Mateo opened his checkbook and calculated numbers that didn't add up to anything resembling hope. After paying for today's supplies, he had $417 to last until the ranch was repossessed. That might buy formula for 2 weeks, diapers for 10 days, assuming he stopped eating entirely. But as he looked toward his bedroom where 3 small lives slept peacefully for perhaps the first time in days, financial impossibility seemed less important than simple human decency. These children had been abandoned by circumstances beyond their control, placed in his care by a twist of fate that felt too specific to be accidental. His grandfather, the man who'd built this ranch from nothing but determination and stubborn hope, used to say that God never gave you more than you could handle, but he wasn't above pushing you right up to your breaking point to see what you were made of. Standing in his kitchen at midnight, calculating the cost of keeping 3 babies alive, Matthew wondered if this was his breaking point or his salvation. The blue-eyed girl woke first, not crying but making soft sounds that suggested hunger without demanding immediate attention. Matthew warmed another bottle and lifted her carefully, surprised again by how natural the motion felt. She drank quietly, her eyes fixed on his face with that same intense study, as if memorizing every detail. "Your mama was trying to get you somewhere safe," he told her quietly. "Someplace called Safe Harbor with a nun who promised to help. I don't know much about nuns or safe harbors, but I know about promises. And I'm promising you right now that you're going to be okay." The words surprised him as he spoke them. He'd made promises before to Carmen about the ranch's future, to himself about turning things around, to his grandfather's memory about keeping the family land in family hands. All of those promises had been broken by drought and debt and his own stubborn inability to adapt to changing times. But this promise felt different. It wasn't about money or property or pride. It was about 3 small lives that had no one else, and a broken-down rancher who suddenly had a reason to fix himself. The girl finished her bottle and burped with surprising force, a sound that made Matthew smile for the first time in weeks. She settled back against his shoulder, and he could feel her heartbeat through her tiny chest, fast and strong and absolutely trusting. Dawn was still hours away, but Matthew began making mental lists of everything that needed to happen. Call the sheriff about the crash, though he'd wait until morning to report it. Contact whoever handled orphan children in Brewster County, though the thought of turning these babies over to strangers made his stomach clench. Figure out what Safe Harbor was, and whether Sister Catherine was still willing to help 3 babies whose mother would never make it to New Mexico. But first, he needed to keep them alive and healthy for another day. Then another. Then however many days it took to figure out what came next. The ranch that had felt like a burden for months suddenly felt like a sanctuary. 3 babies needed space to grow, clean air to breathe, and the kind of quiet that only came from being far away from the complications of city life. They needed someone who understood that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply refuse to give up. Looking out his bedroom window at land that stretched empty and endless under a blanket of stars, Matthew Castellanos realized that maybe his grandfather had been right. Maybe God didn't give you more than you could handle. Maybe he just gave you exactly what you needed to become the person you were supposed to be. 3 babies slept peacefully in dresser drawers, their breathing soft and steady in the desert silence. And for the first time since the drought began, Matthew felt like something was finally growing on his land. Dawn arrived with the persistent crying of 3 hungry babies, and the realization that Matthew's emergency formula supply wouldn't last another day. He'd managed maybe 2 hours of actual sleep, catnapping between feedings while his mind raced through scenarios that all seemed to end with him failing these children the way he'd failed at everything else lately. The blue-eyed girl, he'd started thinking of her as Blue woke first and seemed content to study the ceiling fan while her siblings continued sleeping. There was something unsettling about her alertness, the way she tracked movement and focused on his face when he leaned over her makeshift crib. Most babies her age spent their time eating, sleeping, and staring at nothing in particular. Blue watched everything with the intensity of someone taking inventory. Her brother stirred next, immediately announcing his displeasure with a cry that could wake cattle 3 counties over. The boy had volume that seemed impossible for his small frame, and once he got started, stopping him required immediate action. Matthew had learned this lesson around 3 in the morning when 5 minutes of crying had escalated into a full-scale tantrum that only ended when he'd walked laps around the house while bouncing gently. The 3rd baby, the quiet sister with brown eyes, woke without fanfare and waited patiently for attention. She seemed to understand that her brother's volume got him first service, and accepted her place in the feeding rotation with a composure that reminded Matthew of his grandmother, the kind of woman who could endure anything with dignity intact. After morning feedings and diaper changes that used up more of his limited supplies, Matthew faced the reality that he needed help. The nearest neighbor was Hendrick's place, 5 miles east through a landscape that looked like God's rough draft for Mars. Jim Hendricks had been dealing with his own drought problems, but his wife Sarah had raised 4 children and might know something about keeping babies alive. Loading 3 infants into a pickup truck designed for hauling feed and equipment presented challenges Matthew hadn't anticipated. The wooden crate fit awkwardly on the passenger seat, and securing it with the seatbelt felt like solving a puzzle designed by someone who'd never seen a baby. Blue watched the process with what looked suspiciously like amusement, while her siblings seemed resigned to whatever adventure their new guardian had planned. The drive to the Hendricks place normally took 12 minutes, with 3 babies requiring frequent reassurance and a driving style that prioritized gentle turns over speed. It stretched to nearly half an hour. Every bump in the road prompted at least one cry of protest, and Matthew found himself talking to them, constantly explaining where they were going, pointing out landmarks, promising that Mrs. Hendricks would know what to do. "That's where the old Martinez windmill used to be," he told them as they passed a rusted tower that hadn't turned in years. Your mama would have driven right past there yesterday, probably wondering what kind of place she'd brought you to. Don't blame her for that. This country takes some getting used to. Blue made a soft cooing sound that might have been agreement or gas, but Matthew chose to interpret it as conversation. Talking to the babies felt natural in a way that surprised him. He'd lived alone for so long that he'd almost forgotten how to speak to another person. But babies didn't judge your conversational skills or expect witty responses. The Hendricks ranch looked marginally better than his own. The fence posts were straighter, the paint on the house more recent, the vegetable garden still showing signs of life despite the drought. Sarah Hendricks appeared on the porch before Matthew had finished packing, her weathered face creasing into concern as she saw the crate in his passenger seat. "Matthew Salanos," she called out. "What in Sam Hill have you got there?" "Babies," he replied, lifting the crate carefully. "3 of them. Found them yesterday after their mama crashed down in Devil's Canyon." Sarah's expression shifted from surprise to something deeper, the look of a woman who'd seen enough of life to know that babies didn't just appear without accompanying tragedy. She held the screen door open as Matthew maneuvered the crate through the entrance, her eyes already cataloging what he'd done right and wrong in the past 12 hours. "Set them down on the kitchen table," she instructed, washing her hands at the sink with the efficiency of someone for whom baby emergencies were familiar territory. "Jim," she called toward the back of the house. "Come see what Matthew brought us." Jim Hendricks emerged from what looked like a home office, reading glasses perched on his forehead and the expression of a man who'd been wrestling with paperwork. He stopped short when he saw the babies, his face cycling through the same emotions his wife had shown. "Jesus," he muttered. "Where'd they come from?" Matthew explained about the crash, about Rebecca Tompkins and her desperate journey towards safe harbor, about waking up responsible for 3 lives he had no idea how to protect. Sarah listened while examining each baby with gentle, experienced hands, checking reflexes and responses with the thoroughness of someone who'd raised children in a place where the nearest doctor was an hour's drive away. "They're in good shape," she announced after her examination. "Whoever their mama was, she took care of them right up until the end. This one's got a little diaper rash," she indicated the quiet sister, "and they're all probably dehydrated. But nothing that can't be fixed." "I used up most of my formula," Matthew admitted. "Don't know what I'm going to feed them tonight." Sarah exchanged a look with her husband, one of those wordless conversations that couples develop after decades together. Jim shrugged, which Sarah apparently interpreted as permission to commit their household to whatever she was thinking. "We've got cases of formula in the storage room," she said. "Left over from when our grandson visited last Christmas. Diapers, too. You're welcome to whatever you need." The relief Matthew felt was so intense it made his knees weak. "I can pay you back when what?" Sarah interrupted. "When will you win the lottery? When it starts raining again? When will the bank decide to forgive your loan?" She shook her head. "These babies need help now. You can pay us back by keeping them alive and healthy." Jim had been studying the babies while his wife talked, paying particular attention to Blue, who was studying him right back. "This one's got old eyes," he observed. "Looks like she's been here before." "I noticed that too," Matthew said. "Sometimes I swear she understands every word I say." "Babies are smarter than most people give them credit for," Sarah said, lifting the crying boy and bouncing him with practiced ease. "They pick up on emotions, read faces, figure out who they can trust. This little guy's already decided you're safe. He wouldn't have stopped crying for you otherwise." As if to prove her point, the boy quieted the moment Matthew took him back, settling against his shoulder with the contentment of someone who'd found his place in the world. The feeling of being needed, truly needed, by another human being was something Matthew had almost forgotten. "What are you going to call them?" Sarah asked. The question caught Matthew off guard. He'd been thinking of them as the babies or by their distinguishing characteristics, but they needed names. Real names that would belong to them as they grew into whatever they were meant to become. "I don't know," he admitted. It didn't feel right to name them without knowing what their mama wanted to call them. Sarah lifted Blue from the crate and held her at eye level. The baby stared back without blinking, her expression serious and somehow ancient. "This one looks like Grace to me." Grace with the blue eyes that see everything. Grace. The name fit so perfectly that Matthew wondered why he hadn't thought of it himself. "Grace," he repeated, and the baby turned toward his voice as if recognizing something fundamental about the sound. "The boy could be Samuel," Jim suggested. "Sam for short. Strong name for a strong set of lungs." "And this quiet little lady," Sarah said, picking up the brown-eyed sister. "She's got the look of hope about her. Patient and steady, like she knows everything's going to work out fine, even when it doesn't look that way." Grace, Sam, and Hope. 3 names for 3 lives that had become his responsibility through circumstances that still felt too unlikely to be accidental. Matthew tested each name silently, watching for reactions, and could have sworn that all 3 babies responded with something like approval. Hendricks loaded his truck with enough supplies to last a week: formula, diapers, baby food, even a proper car seat that their daughter had left behind years ago. They refused payment and declined his offers to work off the debt, treating the whole transaction like neighbors helping neighbors during hard times. "You call us if you need anything," Sarah insisted as they prepared to leave. "Day or night. Doesn't matter. Babies don't keep regular hours, and you're going to need sleep eventually." The drive home felt different with the truck loaded with supplies and 3 babies who now had names instead of just needs. Grace remained alert and watchful. Sam dozed fitfully between complaints about road conditions, and Hope observed everything with quiet satisfaction. "Looks like we're really doing this," Matthew told them as his ranch house came into view. "You 3 are stuck with me, and I'm stuck with you. We'll figure it out as we go." Back at the house, he set up a more permanent nursery in the spare bedroom, using the supplies from the Hendricks to create something that looked almost professional. 3 cribs made from dresser drawers arranged around a changing station, improvised from a folding table. A feeding area near the window where morning light would help with those early breakfast battles. As afternoon wore into evening, Matthew found himself settling into routines that felt natural despite being completely new. Feed Grace first because she waited patiently, then Sam because his volume demanded immediate attention, then Hope because she seemed to prefer going last. Change diapers in the same order, perp each baby thoroughly, check that they are comfortable before moving on to the next task. Grace proved to be the most interactive, responding to his voice and following his movements around the room. Sam was the most demanding, requiring constant attention and creative solutions to keep him content. Hope was the observer, watching everything with calm intelligence and rarely complaining unless something was seriously wrong. By bedtime, Matthew realized that somewhere during the day, his thinking had shifted from keeping them alive until someone else takes over, to simply keeping them alive. These weren't temporary guests anymore. They were Grace, Sam, and Hope, and they belonged here as much as anywhere else. But as he settled them down for the night, checking locks and loading his rifle out of habit, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful day had been calm before some kind of storm. Rebecca Tompkins had been running from something, and whatever had scared her enough to risk everything on a desperate drive across 3 states might not have given up just because she was dead. Grace was the last to fall asleep, her blue eyes tracking his movements around the room with that unsettling intensity. Just before she closed her eyes, she made a soft sound, not crying or cooing, but something that sounded almost like a word. Matthew leaned closer, wondering if he'd imagined it. But Grace was already asleep, leaving him to wonder what a 6-month-old baby might have been trying to tell him, and why it felt like a warning. The black sedan appeared on Matthew's horizon 3 days after he'd stopped thinking of Grace, Sam, and Hope as temporary visitors. It moved slowly along the ranch road, kicking up dust that hung in the still air like a signal flare announcing unwelcome attention. Matthew watched from the kitchen window while warming bottles for the morning feeding, his stomach tightening with the kind of dread that came from experience with trouble. Nobody drove out to his ranch unless they were lost, delivering bad news, or looking for something they had no business finding. The car was too clean for local law enforcement, too expensive for social services, and too deliberate in its approach to tourists who'd taken a wrong turn. It moved with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Grace sensed his tension immediately. She'd been content in her bouncer seat, watching dust motes dance in the morning sunlight. But the moment Matthew's mood shifted, she began making soft sounds of distress. Her siblings were still sleeping, but Grace had developed an uncanny ability to read the emotional temperature of any room she occupied. "It's okay, little girl," Matthew murmured, though they both knew he was lying. He'd learned enough about Grace in 3 days to know that she understood far more than babies were supposed to understand. She processed information like a tiny computer, filing away details and patterns that most adults would miss. The sedan pulled into his driveway with the entitled confidence of people who weren't planning to ask permission for anything. 2 men emerged, both wearing suits that cost more than Matthew's monthly grocery budget. The driver was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of posture that screamed military background. His passenger was shorter, stockier, with soft features that might have looked friendly if not for his eyes pale and calculating, like a snake evaluating prey. Matthew opened the front door before they could knock, stepping onto the porch and pulling the door closed behind him. Whatever these men wanted, they weren't getting inside his house where 3 babies slept peacefully in rooms that had finally started feeling like home. "Mr. Castellanos?" The gray-haired man spoke with a slight accent that might have been Boston or Baltimore, somewhere north and expensive. "My name is Vincent Morrison. This is my associate, Mr. Hayes. We're private investigators working on behalf of the Ashford family." The name hit Matthew like a physical blow. Ashford. He'd seen that name on Rebecca Tompkins' scattered belongings, credit card statements, a few pieces of mail that had followed her on her desperate journey across 3 states. The Ashfords weren't just any family. They were Louisiana oil money, the kind of wealth that turned politicians into puppets and made problems disappear. "Don't know any Ashfords," Matthew said carefully. Morrison smiled without warmth. "Perhaps not. But we believe you may have recently come into possession of something that belongs to them. 3 things, to be precise." Hayes stepped forward, his soft face arranging itself into what was probably meant to be a sympathetic expression. "We understand there was a tragic accident a few days ago. A young woman named Rebecca Tompkins lost her life not far from your property. We're here to collect her children and return them to their rightful family." "Rightful family," Matthew repeated. "That would be their mother, last I checked, and she's dead." "Their father," Morrison corrected, "is Thomas Ashford III. He's been searching for these children since they disappeared from New Orleans 2 weeks ago. Miss Tompkins took them without permission and fled the state. Technically, that makes her a kidnapper, though given the circumstances, the family is prepared to be generous in their interpretation of events." Matthew felt something cold settle in his chest. She was their mother. Mothers don't kidnap their own children. Hayes pulled out a leather portfolio and extracted several documents. "Actually, Mr. Castellanos, according to Louisiana Family Court, Ms. Tompkins had no legal custody of these children. Mr. Ashford was granted full custody 3 weeks ago after Ms. Tompkins was deemed an unfit parent. Drug use, unstable housing, inability to provide proper care. The court had no choice but to remove the children from her custody." The papers looked official, complete with stamps and signatures, but Matthew had seen enough of Rebecca's letter to know there was more to This story. She'd written about the father not knowing the children existed, about his family destroying them if they found out. Either she'd been lying, or these men were. If this Thomas Ashford is their father, Matthew said slowly, where's he been for the past 6 months? Why didn't he claim them before now? Morrison's smile grew thinner. Family dynamics can be complicated. Mr. Castellanos, what matters is that we're here now to bring the children home where they belong. The Ashford family has resources, private doctors, the finest schools, opportunities that a struggling rancher simply cannot provide. The emphasis on struggling wasn't subtle. These men had done their homework, knew about his financial problems, his upcoming foreclosure, his complete lack of resources for raising 3 children. They were offering him a way out of an impossible situation, and making it clear that cooperation would be much easier than resistance. I'd like to see some identification, Matthew said. And something that proves you're authorized to collect these children. Hayes reached into his jacket slowly, movements deliberately visible and non-threatening. He produced a wallet containing a private investigator's license and a notarized letter of authorization from something called the Ashford Family Trust. Everything looked legitimate, but Matthew had learned not to trust things that looked too perfect. The local authorities have been notified, Morrison added. Sheriff's Department knows we're here, knows why we're here. This can be handled quietly and peacefully, or it can become a legal matter that draws unwanted attention to your situation. From inside the house came the sound of Sam, waking up an escalating series of complaints that would soon become full-throated demands for attention. Morrison and Hayes exchanged glances, their expressions sharpening with interest. They're awake, Hayes observed unnecessarily. Why don't we go inside and get this sorted out? The sooner we can collect them, the sooner everyone can get back to their normal lives. Matthew didn't move from the doorway. What makes you think their normal life is with people they've never met? They've been through enough trauma without being handed off to strangers. Strangers? Morrison's eyebrows rose. Mr. Castellanos, you've known these children for 3 days. The Ashford family has been searching for them for weeks. They have medical records, birth certificates, legal documentation proving their relationship. What exactly do you have? What Matthew had was the memory of 3 babies sleeping peacefully in his arms, the trust in Grace's blue eyes when she looked at him, the way Hope smiled when he sang her to sleep. He had the knowledge that Rebecca Tompkins had died trying to keep her children away from these people, and the growing certainty that letting them take Grace, Sam, and Hope would be the biggest mistake of his life. Sam's crying escalated to the point where ignoring it became impossible. Grace and Hope would be awake soon, demanding breakfast and clean diapers, and the kind of attention that couldn't be postponed for adult conversations about legal custody and family rights. I need to take care of them, Matthew said. They're hungry. Of course, Morrison agreed. We'll wait. But waiting wasn't what they had in mind. The moment Matthew stepped back inside his house, both men followed without invitation. Hayes moved toward the kitchen while Morrison examined the living room with the calculating gaze of someone appraising property for auction. In the nursery, Grace was sitting up in her makeshift crib, watching the doorway with that unsettling intensity. She'd learned to recognize Matthew's footsteps, his voice, the particular rhythm of his approach during feeding time. But when she saw the strangers behind him, her expression changed to something that looked remarkably like fear. Sam's crying intensified when Morrison leaned over his crib, and Hope, who rarely cried about anything, began making distressed sounds the moment Hayes reached toward her. All 3 babies seemed to sense that these men represented danger, and their unanimous rejection of the strangers made Matthew's protective instincts flare like a struck match. They don't know you, he said, moving to block Hayes from picking up Hope. You're scaring them. Children adapt quickly, Morrison replied, lifting Sam despite his protests. The Ashford family has experienced nannies, pediatric specialists. and everything these children need for proper development. A few days of adjustment, and they'll forget this place ever existed. Watching a stranger hold Sam, hearing his distressed cries echo off the walls of the room where he'd learned to feel safe, filled Matthew with rage so pure it made his vision narrow. These men were treating the babies like property to be collected, not children who'd already bonded with their caregiver. Grace had gone completely silent, which worried Matthew more than crying would have. She was studying Morrison with the intensity of someone memorizing details for future reference, her blue eyes tracking his movements with unsettling focus. When Morrison reached for her, she did something that made everyone in the room freeze. She spoke, not baby babble or random sounds, but a clear, unmistakable word: no. The silence that followed fell like the moment between lightning and thunder, charged with electricity and the promise of something powerful about to break loose. 6-month-old babies didn't speak words. They made sounds, they cried, they laughed, but they didn't form consonants and vowels into recognizable language. Morrison stared at Grace with newfound interest. Remarkable. The family will be very interested to hear about this development. But Matthew heard something else in Morrison's voice, a hunger that had nothing to do with reuniting children with their family. Grace wasn't just unusually alert and intelligent. She was something else entirely, something that made men in expensive suits drive hundreds of miles into the Texas desert. "Put them down," Matthew said quietly. Hayes laughed. "I don't think you understand the situation, Mr. Castellanos. These children are coming with us, whether you cooperate or not. The only question is whether this needs to become unpleasant." "Unpleasant for who?" The voice came from the kitchen doorway. Jim Hendricks stood there with his weathered hands resting casually on his belt buckle, but Matthew knew him well enough to recognize the stance of a man ready for trouble. Behind him, Sarah appeared with a casserole dish and the expression of a woman who'd raised 4 children and wasn't impressed by city men in fancy suits. "Brought you some dinner," Sarah announced, as if armed strangers in the nursery were perfectly normal. "Figured you might have your hands full." Morrison's confidence flickered slightly. 2 witnesses complicated things, especially witnesses who looked like they'd been dealing with difficult situations longer than he'd been alive. "This is a private family matter," he said, adjusting his grip on Sam. "We're here to collect Mr. Ashford's children." "Funny," Jim replied. "These babies look perfectly collected to me. Clean, fed, healthy. Can't say I see much need for improvement." Hayes stepped forward with his soft smile still in place. "Gentlemen, please. We understand your neighbor has formed an attachment to these children, but the law is quite clear. We have full legal authority to." Grace spoke again. This time it wasn't just one word. This time, in a voice that carried impossible clarity for someone her age, she said, "Bad men. Hurt Mama." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Morrison's face went pale, and Hayes took an involuntary step backward. Even Jim and Sarah stared at Grace with expressions of shock and growing understanding. "Jesus Christ," Hayes whispered. "What kind of freak are you raising out here?" That was his mistake. The moment he called Grace a freak, every adult in the room, even Morrison, understood that whatever was happening here had moved far beyond legal custody and family rights. Matthew reached for Grace, and she came to him eagerly, wrapping small arms around his neck with desperate strength. Over her head, he met Morrison's eyes and saw something that confirmed his worst fears. These men weren't here to reunite children with their family. They were here to collect something valuable, something worth killing for, and Grace with her. Impossible intelligence and premature speech was exactly what they'd come to find. The standoff in the nursery stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Morrison still held Sam, who had stopped crying and was staring at the stranger with the same unnatural awareness that Grace displayed. Hope remained in her crib, silent and watchful, while Grace clung to Matthew with strength that seemed impossible. For someone her size. Nobody's going anywhere until we sort this out proper, Jim Hendricks announced, his weathered hands now openly resting on the pistol at his hip. Sarah, why don't you call Sheriff Martinez? Tell him we've got some folks out here making claims they can't back up. Hayes reached inside his jacket with deliberate slowness, producing his cell phone. Actually, I think you'll find the sheriff is expecting our call. He dialed a number and put the phone on speaker. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. Martinez. Here, Sheriff, this is Detective Hayes. We're at the Castellanos Ranch collecting the Tompkins children as discussed. We've encountered some local resistance. A pause that felt heavy with implications. Mr. Castellanos, you there? I'm here. Sheriff, look, Matthew, I know this is hard, but these men have proper documentation. Court orders from Louisiana, authorization from Child Protective Services. I've seen the paperwork myself. Those babies need to go with their legal guardians. Matthew felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Sheriff Martinez had been a friend of his father's, had watched Matthew grow up, had always been someone you could count on to do the right thing. But the voice on the phone sounded strained, like a man reading from a script he didn't believe. Sheriff, Jim Hendricks called out, you need to get out here yourself. Something ain't right about this situation. Can't do that, Jim. I'm dealing with a multi-vehicle accident on Highway 90, going to be tied up for hours. These investigators have full authority to handle the transfer. Hayes ended the call with a satisfied smile. As you can see, gentlemen, everything is perfectly legal and above board. Now, if you'll excuse us, we need to collect the children and be on our way. But Grace had other plans. As Morrison moved toward the door with Sam, she looked directly at the man holding her brother and spoke again, not to Matthew or Hendricks, but to Morrison himself. You killed Mama, she said in that impossibly clear voice. You made the car crash. Morrison stopped dead, his face cycling through expressions of shock, fear, and something darker. That's impossible. The accident was investigated. Mechanical failure, driver fatigue. You followed her, Grace continued, her blue eyes never leaving Morrison's face. 3 days, 3 nights, scared her, made her drive too fast. Hayes grabbed Morrison's arm. Vincent, we need to go, now. But Morrison seemed transfixed by Grace's words. How could she possibly know that? She's a baby. She wasn't even conscious during the... He stopped himself, but the damage was done. During the what? Matthew asked. Quietly. During the chase, during the murder? Sarah Hendricks had gone pale. Jim, get on the radio. Call the state police, the FBI, anybody who'll listen. These men are killers. Morrison finally seemed to remember where he was and who he was supposed to be. This is ridiculous. You're all letting your imaginations run wild because of some random baby sounds. Children that age don't speak in complete sentences. This one does, Grace said, as if proving his point. This one remembers everything. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Hope making soft cooing noises from her crib. Even Sam had gone quiet, studying the adults around him with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. Hayes was the first to recover. Vincent, grab the other 2. We're leaving. These people can't stop us. They have no legal standing. But as Morrison reached for Hope, she did something that made everyone in the room take a step back. Her brown eyes, which had always seemed gentle and patient, suddenly blazed with light that had no earthly source. The temperature in the room dropped so fast that their breath became visible, and every piece of electronic equipment in the house began making distressed sounds. Don't touch my sister, Hope said in a voice that carried harmonics no human throat should produce. Morrison jerked his hand back as if he'd been burned. What the hell, language? Sam interrupted primly, speaking his first words in a tone that suggested he found Morrison's vocabulary offensive. Babies present. Hayes pulled out a gun, Not a service weapon, but something sleek and expensive. That looked designed for close-range work. Enough games. Whatever kind of freaks these things are, they're coming with us. The family has invested too much in this project to walk away empty-handed. Project? Maffeo repeated, understanding flooding through him like ice water. These aren't Thomas Ashford's children. You don't even know who Thomas Ashford is. Morrison's professional mask finally slipped completely. Smart man. Too bad you figured it out too late to matter. The truth hit Maffeo with devastating clarity. Rebecca Tompkins hadn't been running from an ex-boyfriend or an abusive family. She'd been running from people who'd done something to her children, something that had made them unnaturally intelligent, unnaturally aware, unnaturally powerful. What did you do to them? He asked. Nothing they weren't designed for, Hayes replied, keeping the gun trained on Jim Hendricks while Morrison moved toward the cribs. Do you have any idea how much governments pay for enhanced intelligence? How much private military contractors will spend for soldiers who can think faster, process information better, predict enemy movements? They're babies, Sarah said, her voice breaking. They're the future, Morrison corrected. Genetic enhancement, neural stimulation, cognitive acceleration, we've been working on this program for 15 years. These three represent our most successful results. Grace tightened her grip on Maffeo's neck. Mama said no more tests. Mama said no more needles. Mama said, run. Your mama was a surrogate, Hayes explained with clinical detachment. Paid very well to carry enhanced embryos to term. She was supposed to deliver the children to our facility for continued development. Instead, she got attached and tried to steal our property. So you killed her, Jim said flatly. We recovered our investment, Morrison replied. Though I'll admit the crash wasn't our preferred method. We'd hoped to retrieve the subjects without damage. Hope made us sound like wind chimes in a storm. And every window in the house began to rattle. Sam giggled, and the lights flickered in rhythm with his laughter. Grace continued staring at Morrison with eyes that seemed to look through him to something beyond. You're scared, she observed. You don't understand what you made. Morrison raised his hand as if to strike her, then thought better of it when the temperature in the room plummeted another 10 degrees. We understand perfectly. You're enhanced humans with accelerated development. Valuable assets that belong to people with the resources to use you properly. We belong to Maffeo, Sam said matter-of-factly. He feeds us. He sings to us. He loves us. Love is irrelevant, Hayes snapped. You're coming with us whether you want to or not. That's when Hope decided she'd heard enough. The gentle, patient baby who rarely cried and never complained looked directly at Hayes and said, no. The gun in his hand began to glow red-hot. Hayes yelped and dropped it, shaking burned fingers, while the weapon clattered to the floor and continued heating until the metal began to smoke. Morrison backed toward the door, still carrying Sam, his face pale with fear and fascination. Fascinating. Telekinetic abilities weren't part of the original enhancement protocol. They're evolving beyond our projections. Put him down, Maffeo ordered, but Morrison shook his head. I'm taking at least one. The family has too much invested to walk away completely empty-handed. This one seems less developed than his sisters. I'm not less developed, Sam informed him politely. I'm just more subtle. That's when Morrison's expensive suit began to unravel. Not tearing or burning, but actually coming apart at the molecular level. Threads separating and fabric dissolving until he was standing in his underwear, holding a baby who was smiling with innocent satisfaction. Hayes was backing toward the kitchen, his burned hand clutched against his chest. Vincent, we need to retreat and regroup. Call for backup. Tranquilizer guns, maybe. There won't be any backup, Grace said with certainty that chilled everyone in the room. You told your people you could handle 3 babies. You told them we're just smart, not dangerous. They don't know what we really are. Morrison looked down at Sam, who was patting his chest with tiny hands that seemed to be evaluating the structural integrity of his remaining clothing. "What are you?" "We're family," Hope answered. "And families protect each other." The house began to shake, not violently, but with a steady rhythm like a massive heartbeat. Pictures fell from walls, dishes rattled in cabinets, and the floorboards creaked with stress that should have been impossible from such a small source. "Enough." Hayes pulled out a backup weapon, a taser designed for riot control. "Enhanced or not, electrical current will drop them just like anyone else." He aimed at Grace, but before he could fire, Sarah Hendricks hit him in the head with her casserole dish. The ceramic exploded on impact, covering Hayes in green bean casserole and rendering him unconscious before he hit the floor. "Nobody threatens babies in my presence," she announced calmly, adjusting her apron. Morrison looked around the room at Jim Hendricks with his gun drawn, at Sarah standing over an unconscious federal agent, at 3 babies who were demonstrating abilities that shouldn't exist. His professional composure finally cracked completely. "This isn't over," he said, setting Sam carefully in his crib and backing toward the door. "The family knows where you are. They have resources you can't imagine. More agents, better equipment, legal authority you can't fight." "Maybe," Matthew agreed, "but they don't have what I have." "Which is?" Matthew looked at Grace, Sam, and Hope, 3 children who'd been created as weapons, but had chosen to become family. "I have them, and they have me." Grace smiled for the first time since the strangers had arrived. "Bad men go away now," she announced. "Family stays together." Morrison fled, leaving his unconscious partner behind and carrying with him the knowledge that the Ashford Project had created something far more dangerous than enhanced intelligence. In the sudden quiet that followed, Sam looked up at Matthew and asked, "What's for lunch? Fighting makes me hungry." Hope giggled, the first normal baby-like sound she'd made since the crisis began. Grace relaxed in Matthew's arms, her supernatural awareness fading back to the innocent curiosity of a well-loved child. But Matthew knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere, powerful people were planning their next move. And next time, they'd come prepared for children who could fight back, outside. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon for the first time in months, as if the earth itself was responding to the extraordinary events unfolding on a small ranch in the middle of nowhere. The drought was about to break. And so was everything else. The unconscious agent sprawled across Matthew's kitchen floor, posed problems that couldn't be solved with baby formula and good intentions. Hayes wasn't just knocked out, he was evidence of a conspiracy that reached into levels of government that small-town ranchers weren't supposed to know existed. His expensive clothes, sophisticated weapons, and casual discussion of genetic enhancement programs suggested resources that could make 3 extraordinary babies and their protective guardian disappear without a trace. Jim Hendricks zip-tied Hayes's hands with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd dealt with dangerous livestock, while Sarah collected the scattered weapons and electronic devices. Grace watched the proceedings with clinical interest, occasionally offering commentary that no 6-month-old should possess. "He has a transmitter in his jacket," she observed as Sarah went through Hayes's pockets. "Small black box. It tells the bad people where he is." Sarah found the device exactly where Grace had indicated, a sophisticated GPS tracker disguised as a button. She held it up questioningly, and Hope made a dismissive gesture with one tiny hand. The device crumbled to dust, its internal circuitry dissolved by forces that modern science couldn't explain. "Useful skill," Jim muttered, checking Hayes's pulse. "What else can you 3 do?" "We can do lots of things," Sam replied cheerfully. "But Mama said don't show off. She said it makes people scared." "Smart Mama," Sarah agreed, finding Hayes's identification and discovering that his real name was Marcus Webb, employed by something called Meridian Research Solutions, company that didn't appear to exist according to the business cards in his wallet. the storm that had been building. On the horizon arrived with biblical intensity. Rain pounded the ranch house roof like artillery shells, and lightning split the sky every few seconds, illuminating the desert landscape in stark black and white. The drought was ending with the kind of violence that West Texas reserved for. Moments of profound change. Matthew stood at the kitchen window, watching water pour from gutters that hadn't seen use in 8 months. The cattle were standing in the downpour with their heads raised, drinking directly from the sky after months of rationed water and dying hopes. His cracked fields were already beginning to steam as the parched earth absorbed moisture it had almost forgotten how to process. "Phone lines are down," Jim reported, returning from checking the landline. "Cell towers too, most likely. This storm's got teeth." "Good," Grace said from her high chair, where she was methodically destroying the cracker with the focused attention of someone conducting important research. "Storms hide things. Make it hard for bad people to find us." Hope, who rarely spoke unless she had something crucial to contribute, looked up from her bottle. "Mama made the storm," she announced matter-of-factly. "What do you mean?" Matthew asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "Before she died, she was scared for us. So she pushed all her love and fear into the sky and told it to keep us safe." Hope gestured toward the window with her bottle. "Storm's been waiting for the right time." Sam nodded seriously. "Weather responds to strong emotions. Mama taught us that. She said we have to be careful about getting upset, because we might accidentally hurt people." The implications of that statement settled over the adults like a cold blanket. If these children could influence weather patterns through emotional state, if Rebecca Tompkins had somehow programmed a massive storm system to protect her babies, then the scope of their abilities went far beyond party tricks and self-defense. Hayes began to stir, groaning and trying to move hands that wouldn't respond. His eyes opened slowly, focusing first on the ceiling and then on the faces gathered around him. When he saw Grace watching him with those unnaturally blue eyes, he tried to scramble backward and only succeeded in bruising his shoulders against the kitchen cabinets. "Easy there," Jim advised. "You're not going anywhere for a while." "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Hayes said, his voice hoarse from Sarah's casserole dish impact. "Those aren't normal children. They're weapons designed to destabilize entire governments. The people who created them will burn this whole state to the ground before they let their investment walk away." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you came here with guns and threats," Sarah replied tartly. "Play with fire, get burned." Grace slid down from her high chair with the fluid grace of someone much older than 6 months. She walked, not crawled, but actually walked on legs that should barely have been able to support her weight across the kitchen to where Hayes lay bound. "You're wrong about us," she told him quietly. "We're not weapons. Weapons don't choose their targets. We choose love." Hayes laughed bitterly. "Love won't stop a sniper's bullet. Won't prevent a drone strike. The Meridian Project has resources. You can't imagine, little girl. Your guardian angel out there might care about you, but he can't protect you from what's coming." "Maybe not," Grace agreed. "But he doesn't have to do it alone." That's when the real miracle began. The storm wasn't just breaking the drought, it was carrying something else in its winds. Through the rain-lashed darkness, lights began to appear on the horizon. Not the harsh white glare of military vehicles or the searching beams of helicopters, but the warm yellow glow of headlights belonging to pickup trucks, farm vehicles, and cars driven by people who'd received word that their neighbors needed help. The first to arrive was Sheriff Martinez, his cruiser sliding through mud that hadn't existed that morning. He burst through the kitchen door like a man fleeing demons, his uniform soaked and his face grim with the expression of someone who discovered that the people he'd trusted were lying to him. "Matthew," he said without preamble, "I've been playing. Those federal credentials? They're good enough to fool a county sheriff, but not good enough to fool the FBI when you actually check with the FBI. More vehicles followed, the Chen family from the general store, other ranchers from across the county, even the volunteer fire department, despite having no fires to fight. Word had spread through the community network that moved faster than official communications, the way news traveled in places where neighbors actually knew each other's names. "How did you all know to come?" Matthew asked. Mrs. Chun smiled, shaking rain from her coat. "Strangest thing. My radio started playing music it shouldn't have been able to receive, classical stuff, real beautiful. But underneath the music I could swear I heard a baby crying. Made me think about you and those little ones you found." Similar stories emerged from each arrival. Radio signals carrying impossible music, sudden overwhelming urges to check on the Castellanos ranch, dreams of children in danger that had woken entire families. Hope smiled when she heard these accounts, as if she'd been conducting an orchestra only she could hear. Within an hour, Matthew's ranch house was filled with neighbors armed with more than just good intentions. Sheriff Martinez had brought actual FBI contact numbers and was making calls that would bring real federal agents to investigate Meridian Research Solutions. The volunteer fire chief had brought weapons and men who knew how to use them. The women had brought food and medical supplies and the kind of community determination that could move mountains. Hayes watched the transformation with growing despair. "You don't understand," he kept insisting. "The project has government backing, deep state funding, people who make senators disappear when they ask inconvenient questions." "Maybe," Sheriff Martinez replied, updating his incident report on a laptop that somehow still had internet access despite the storm. "But they don't have what we have out here." "Which is?" "Witnesses, documentation, and 3 children who can apparently demonstrate their abilities on command." Martinez looked at Grace, who nodded solemnly. "The FBI is very interested in Meridian Research Solutions now. Turns out they've been investigating unauthorized genetic research for months." Mrs. Chun approached Grace with the careful respect of someone addressing royalty. "Honey, can you really do the things this man says you can do?" Grace considered the question seriously. "I can do things, we all can. But we don't want to hurt anybody. We just want to be a family." "Then that's what you'll be," Mrs. Chun declared with finality. "This community takes care of its own." The federal agents who arrived 6 hours later were nothing like Morrison and Hayes. They wore clearly marked FBI gear, carried proper identification, and treated the children like victims rather than assets. Agent Patricia Valdez, the lead investigator, spent most of her time documenting Hayes' confessions and gathering evidence about Meridian Research Solutions. "The good news," she told Matthew privately, "is that whatever legal documentation those men showed you was completely fabricated. There's no Thomas Ashford III, no family court orders, no legitimate custody arrangements. As far as the law is concerned, these children are orphans in need of placement. And the bad news: the people behind Meridian won't give up easily. Enhanced children represent billions of dollars in research and potential military applications. You'll need federal protection, new identities, relocation to somewhere these people can't find you." Matthew looked through the kitchen window at Grace, Sam, and Hope playing in the mud puddles that had formed in his yard, the first standing water his land had seen in 8 months. They were laughing and splashing like normal children, their supernatural abilities temporarily forgotten in the simple joy of puddle jumping. "What if we don't want to relocate?" he asked. "What if we want to stay here?" Agent Valdez followed. His gaze, "Mr. Castellanos, these children stopped a drought through sheer force of will. They defended themselves against armed agents using abilities that defy scientific explanation. They're not going to have normal lives no matter where they go." "Maybe not," Matthew agreed. "But they can have loved lives. They can have a family. They can have a place where people know their names and care about their future. Outside, Grace looked up from her puddle exploration and waved at him through the window. Sam was showing Hope how to make mud pies, and Hope was improving on his technique by making the mud hole perfect geometric shapes. They were strange children, certainly. Extraordinary children, undoubtedly. But they were also just children who deserved to grow up somewhere safe. The community's already decided, Sheriff Martinez added, joining their conversation. Voted on it while you two were talking. Matthew's staying, the kids are staying, and anyone who comes looking for trouble will find more than they bargained. Four. Agent Valdez shook her head. You people have no idea what you're up against. Grace chose that moment to stick her head through the kitchen door, mud-streaked and grinning. Agent Valdez, she said politely, your phone's going to ring in 30 seconds. It's your boss. Meridian Research Solutions just got raided by federal marshals. The bad people are gone. Exactly 30 seconds later, Agent Valdez's phone rang. The conversation that followed confirmed that Meridian's funding had been cut, their facilities seized, and their leadership arrested for unauthorized human experimentation. How did you know that? Valdez asked when she hung up. Grace shrugged. A gesture that looked oddly adult on someone so young. Sometimes I just know things. Mama said it's because I pay attention to patterns other people miss. As evening settled over the ranch, the storm moved on toward the east, leaving behind a landscape transformed by water and hope. The cattle were grazing on grass that had sprouted in hours rather than weeks. The well that had been dry was flowing. Again, the fields that had been cracked earth were showing the first green shoots of new growth. Matthew sat on his porch with Grace in his lap, watching Sam and Hope chase fireflies that had appeared as if by magic. The air smelled of rain and growing things and the kind of peace that comes after surviving something that should have destroyed you. Are you really going to keep us? Grace asked quietly. Forever, Matthew promised, if you'll have me. Grace smiled and settled more comfortably against his chest. Mama said you would say that. She said some people are born to be family, even if they don't start out that way. Your mama was a smart woman. She still is, Hope called from the yard, where she was teaching Sam to make fireflies blink in synchronized patterns. Dead doesn't mean gone. Just means watching from farther away. As if to prove her point, the evening breeze carried the faint scent of wildflowers, Rebecca Tompkins' favorite perfume, according to the letter she'd left. It was impossible, of course. Wildflowers didn't bloom in the desert after a single storm. But then again, 6-month-old babies didn't speak in complete sentences, didn't demonstrate telekinetic abilities, and didn't orchestrate the rescue of their adoptive father through supernatural means. In West Texas, under a sky full of stars that seemed brighter than usual, impossible things were becoming the new normal. And Matthew Castellanos, failed rancher turned father of 3 extraordinary children, discovered that sometimes the family you need finds you when you're least prepared to receive it. 3 years after the storm that changed everything, Matthew Castellanos stood in the same kitchen where federal agents had once threatened to steal his children, watching Grace explain quantum physics to a visiting professor from the University of Texas. She was 3.5 years old, spoke 7 languages fluently, and had just published her first peer-reviewed paper on theoretical mathematics under a pseudonym that protected her identity while advancing human knowledge by decades. You see, Professor Williams, Grace was saying, using blocks to demonstrate concepts that had taken Einstein years to formulate. The problem with current string theory is that it assumes reality operates on fixed dimensional parameters. But reality is actually much more flexible than that. Professor Williams, a gray-haired woman who'd driven 4 hours from Austin because she couldn't believe the reports she'd been receiving, stared at the child with the expression of someone watching their entire understanding of the universe reorganize itself. This is impossible, she whispered. Even if someone could comprehend these concepts at such a young age, the mathematical proofs alone would require. Hope looked up from her coloring book, where she was drawing pictures. That moved when you looked at them correctly. Math isn't that hard, she said mildly. It's just another language. Like Spanish or bird songs or the way plants talk to each other underground. Sam, who was building a tower out of wooden blocks that somehow defied gravity by staying perfectly balanced despite having no structural foundation, added, Grace is good with numbers. I'm better with making things work. Hope's the best at understanding feelings. The professor turned to Matthew with pleading eyes. How is this possible? What kind of education are you providing? What methods? None, Matthew replied honestly. They teach themselves. They teach each other. Sometimes I swear they teach me things I didn't know I needed to learn. It was true. In the 3 years since finding 3 babies in a wooden crate, Matthew had discovered that being the father of extraordinary children meant becoming extraordinary himself. Not through supernatural abilities, he remained thoroughly human, but through the daily miracle of watching impossible things become routine. The ranch had transformed along with its inhabitants. Where drought-killed fields had once stretched toward the horizon, lush pastures now supported cattle that produced milk with unusual nutritional properties. The vegetables in Sarah Hendrick's expanded garden grew larger, healthier, and more flavorful than anything the soil should have been able to produce. The well that had run dry now flowed with water so pure that people drove from 3 counties away just to fill their jugs. It's not magic, Grace had explained to a team of agricultural scientists who'd visited the previous spring. It's just paying attention to what the land needs and helping it get there faster. Plants want to grow. Soil wants to be fertile. Animals want to be healthy. We just encourage them. The encouragement had effects that rippled far beyond the ranch boundaries. Property values throughout Brewster County had doubled as people discovered that proximity to the Castellanos place seemed to improve everything from crop yields to well water to the general health and happiness of livestock. Families that had been struggling to hold on to generational land suddenly found their fortunes reversed. Mrs. Chun's general store had expanded into a small department store, then into a distribution center for organic produce that shipped across 3 states. The volunteer fire department had received federal funding for new equipment after a mysterious series of grants appeared from sources that didn't seem to exist when investigated. The local school had attracted teachers from major universities who came to conduct research and stayed because something about the area made them remember why they'd fallen in love with education in the first place. We're not trying to change everything, Hope had told a journalist who'd driven out from Dallas to investigate reports of unusual phenomena. We just want to live here peacefully. But peaceful places make other people peaceful too. It spreads. The journalist, a cynical woman who'd covered wars and political scandals and had never believed in anything that couldn't be documented, had stayed for 3 days. She'd left with a story about community cooperation and sustainable agriculture that never mentioned supernatural abilities or enhanced children. She'd also left with a sense of hope she hadn't felt since childhood and a resolution to change careers into something that helped people instead of just documenting their failures. Was how it worked with the children. They didn't force change on anyone. They simply existed in a way that made it easier for other people to be their best selves. Visitors left feeling more optimistic about humanity. Neighbors found themselves resolving long-standing disputes for no reason they could articulate. Children who attended the local school, which Grace, Sam, and Hope attended despite being years ahead, academically showed improved test scores and decreased behavioral problems across the board. It's not manipulation, Grace had assured Matthew when he'd worried about the ethical implications of his children's influence. We're not making anyone do anything they don't want to do. We're just creating space for people to choose kindness instead of meanness. hope instead of fear, love instead of anger. Agent Valdez still visited twice a year, officially to check on the children's welfare and unofficially because she'd become part of their extended family. The federal investigation into Meridian Research Solutions had led to the discovery of 17 other facilities conducting unauthorized genetic experiments. All had been shut down, their subjects relocated or reunited with families, their leadership prosecuted under laws that most people didn't know existed. The program that created U3 was terminated completely, she'd told them during her most recent visit. Every sample destroyed, every computer file wiped, every researcher reassigned to projects that can't hurt children. You're the only successes they had, and you're safe now. We were always safe, Sam had replied with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted that the universe was fundamentally benevolent. Mama made sure of that before she died. Rebecca Tompkins remained a presence in their lives in ways that couldn't be explained by science or psychology. Sometimes her perfume would drift through the house on still days when no flowers were blooming. Sometimes the children would have conversations with empty chairs, responding to comments that only they could hear. Sometimes photographs would appear in places where no photographs had been left, images of Rebecca holding her babies, smiling with the peaceful expression of someone who knew her children were exactly where they belonged. Matthew had stopped questioning these occurrences. In a household where 3-year-olds published academic papers and made toys move with their minds, the occasional visitation from a loving mother seemed perfectly reasonable. The adoption papers had been finalized 2 years ago, making the family official in the eyes of law and bureaucracy. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to the disgraced Agent Vincent Morrison, who was serving consecutive life sentences in a federal prison, had presided over a ceremony that felt more like a celebration than a legal proceeding. I've been family court judge for 23 years, she'd told the packed courtroom, and I've never seen children who were more clearly meant to be exactly where they are. This adoption isn't creating a family, it's recognizing one that already existed. Grace had whispered something to Judge Morrison during the ceremony, something that made the stern woman's eyes fill with tears and her voice catch when she pronounced them officially father and children. Later, when asked what Grace had said, the judge would only reply, "She told me something I needed to hear about my own daughter. Something impossible for her to know, but something that healed a relationship I thought was broken forever." The financial struggles that had once threatened to destroy Matthew's legacy became distant memories. The ranch now operated as a profitable enterprise, selling organic produce and grass-fed beef to restaurants and markets that paid premium prices for products that seemed to promote health and well-being in ways that regular food couldn't match. More importantly, the land itself seemed happy. If land could be said to have emotions flourishing in ways that made agricultural experts shake their heads in wonder. It's not about the money, Matthew had told the banker who'd once threatened foreclosure and now called regularly to offer investment opportunities. It's about the land being used for what it's meant to be used for. The children helped me understand what that is. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the house settled into peaceful silence, Matthew would sometimes sit on his porch and marvel at the path that had brought him here. 3 years ago, he'd been a broken man counting down days until his family's legacy died with him. Tonight, he was the father of 3 extraordinary children who made the world brighter simply by existing in it. The drought that had nearly destroyed him now seemed like a necessary preparation, a clearing away of old growth to make room for something unprecedented and wonderful. The financial pressures that had driven him to despair had forced him to appreciate what truly mattered when everything else fell away. The isolation that had nearly killed his spirit had prepared him to value family with the intensity of someone who'd learned to live without it. Professor Williams was preparing to leave, her head still spinning from Grace's casual explanation of concepts that would take her months to fully process. As she gathered her papers and equipment, She turned to Matthew with the expression of someone grappling with profound questions. "Mr. Castellanos," she said carefully, "your children aren't just intelligent. They're something else entirely. Something that could change everything we think we know about human potential. About consciousness itself, about the nature of reality." "Yes," Matthew agreed. "They are. Doesn't that terrify you? The responsibility, the implications, the fact that they might be the first of something completely new in human evolution?" Matthew considered the question while watching Grace help Sam with a puzzle that seemed to solve itself when she touched it. Hope was reading a book written in a language that didn't exist but somehow made perfect sense to her. They looked like normal children engaged in normal activities, except for the way reality seemed to bend slightly around them to accommodate their presence. "3 years ago," he said finally, "I was terrified of failing at everything. Losing the ranch, disappointing my grandfather's memory, dying alone without leaving anything meaningful behind. Now I'm responsible for 3 children who might represent the future of human consciousness, and I've never been less afraid in my life. Why? Because fear is about uncertainty, about not knowing if you're strong enough or good enough or worthy enough to handle what life gives you." Matthew smiled, watching his children exist in their state of casual impossibility. "These 3 taught me that love isn't about being worthy, it's about being willing. And once you're willing to love something completely, everything else becomes just details to work out." Professor Williams drove away shaking her head, carrying with her research that would revolutionize multiple fields of study and a story she'd never be able to tell in its entirety. Like everyone who encountered Grace, Sam, and Hope, she left changed in ways she wouldn't fully understand for years. As darkness settled over the ranch, Matthew gathered his children for their evening routine baths, stories, the gentle transition from day to sleep that had become his favorite part of every day. Tonight, Grace chose a book about space exploration. Sam wanted a story about talking animals, and Hope requested the tale of a mother who loved her children so much that she found a way to keep protecting them even after she was gone. "That's Mama's story," Hope explained to anyone who might be listening. "She's still here, you know, in the rain when it falls, in the wind when it blows warm, in the way strangers become family when they need each other most." Later, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into the quiet peace that Matthew had learned to treasure, he stepped onto his porch and looked up at stars that seemed to shine more brightly over his land than anywhere else. The air smelled of growing things and possibility, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of his cattle moving contentedly through pastures that had been barren just 3 years ago. His phone buzzed with a text message from Jim. "Hendricks, thought you should know Sarah's pregnant again. Due in spring. She says it's because being around your kids reminded her that miracles are still possible." Matthew smiled, understanding that this was how Grace, Sam, and Hope changed the world, not through grand gestures or displays of power, but through the simple act of making people remember what they were capable of when they stopped limiting themselves to what seemed reasonable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors, new opportunities for his extraordinary children to quietly reshape reality through the sheer force of their loving presence. But tonight, standing on the porch of a ranch that had been saved by love disguised as coincidence, Matthew Castellanos knew with absolute certainty that some gifts are too precious to question and too perfect to improve upon. In a wooden crate in Devil's Canyon, 3 babies had been dying of exposure and neglect. In his arms tonight, 3 children slept peacefully, dreaming dreams that would probably solve problems humanity didn't even know it had yet. The whispered words that had stopped his heart cold 3 years ago, "Bad men hurt Mama," had been Grace's first warning that love sometimes requires warriors. But the words that filled his heart with warmth every night were much simpler. "Good night, Daddy, see you in the morning." Family, Matthew had learned, wasn't about blood or biology or even shared species. It was about choosing to build something beautiful together and refusing to let anything destroy what you'd created. In West Texas, under stars that seemed to approve of impossible things, a failed rancher and 3 enhanced children had built exactly that. 5 years had passed since the crate appeared in Devil's Canyon, and Dr. Elena Vasquez stood at the edge of what most people called impossible, watching 8-year-old Grace Castellanos teach a mixed group of human and artificial intelligence researchers how to solve problems that had stumped both species for decades. The mistake everyone makes, Grace was explaining to a room full of PhDs and computer scientists, is thinking that intelligence and consciousness are the same thing. They're not. Intelligence is just processing power. Consciousness is about connection to yourself, to others, to the patterns that hold everything together. Elena had come to the ranch as a skeptic, sent by the National Science Foundation to investigate reports of breakthrough discoveries emerging from rural Texas. She was a neuroscientist who specializes in debunking claims of supernatural abilities. Armed with instruments designed to measure electromagnetic fields, detect fraud, and expose the clever tricks that made ordinary people appear extraordinary, what she'd found instead was 3 children who'd rewritten the fundamental assumptions of human development while remaining so thoroughly grounded in love and family that their abilities seemed like natural extensions of being raised properly rather than products of genetic enhancement. Sam, now 8 years old, was demonstrating his latest project to a team of engineers from NASA. He'd built what looked like a simple wind chime from scrap metal and fishing line, but when the breeze touched it, the device generated enough clean energy to power the entire ranch house. The engineers kept taking measurements, analyzing the components, and shaking their heads in bewilderment. "It's not the materials," Sam explained patiently. "It's about understanding what the wind wants to do and helping it do that more efficiently. Wind doesn't just move air, it moves energy, intention, possibility. You just have to know how to listen." Hope had become something unprecedented in human history, an 8-year-old diplomat. She spent her mornings in regular classes at the local school, where she'd somehow managed to eliminate bullying entirely through methods that psychologists were still trying to understand. Her afternoons were occupied with video calls to world leaders who discovered that a conversation with Hope Castellanos could resolve conflicts that had seemed intractable for decades. Adults make things complicated because they forget that everyone wants the same basic things, Hope had told the United Nations Special Committee on Global Conflict Resolution during her most recent virtual appearance. Food, shelter, safety, love, respect. When people fight, it's usually because they're scared they can't have those things. If you help them feel safe, they remember how to share. The committee had been skeptical until Hope facilitated a breakthrough in Middle Eastern peace negotiations by suggesting that the warring parties plant a shared garden in disputed territory. The idea had seemed absurd until agricultural data showed that the soil in question could, with proper care, feed both populations better than either could manage separately. 3 months later, former enemies were working side by side to cultivate crops that somehow grew faster and healthier than similar plants in surrounding areas. Elena had documented these achievements with the thoroughness of someone who understood that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But the longer she stayed at the ranch, the more she realized that the most remarkable thing about Grace, Sam, and Hope wasn't their individual abilities. It was the way their presence seemed to unlock potential in everyone around them. The local school district had become a model for educational innovation, attracting educators from around the world who came to study teaching methods that produced students with dramatically improved creative problem-solving abilities. The town of Marfa had transformed from a struggling desert community into a thriving hub of sustainable technology and artistic expression. Even the landscape itself seemed more vibrant, more alive, as if the children's presence had awakened something that had been dormant in the earth itself. We're not doing anything special, Grace had insisted when Elena interviewed her for the report that would reshape several academic fields. We're just being ourselves. But maybe being yourself is more powerful than people think it is. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors, a convoy of black SUVs that appeared on the horizon like a storm cloud. Elena felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. In her experience, when government vehicles arrived unannounced at locations where impossible things happened regularly, the results were rarely positive. But Matthew showed no signs of concern as he watched the vehicles approach. He was working in the garden with Hope, who was teaching tomato plants to grow in perfect geometric patterns while maintaining maximum nutritional value. The sight of federal agents didn't interrupt their conversation about plant consciousness and optimal growing conditions. "Should I be worried?" Elena asked. "Not today," Hope replied without looking up from a vine that was reshaping itself under her gentle touch. "These are different people. They want to learn, not take." The lead vehicle disgorged a woman in her 50s wearing a business suit that managed to look both professional and approachable. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, but the expression of someone who'd recently had their worldview fundamentally challenged. "Mr. Castellanos," she called out, approaching the garden with the careful respect of someone entering sacred space. "I'm Director Catherine Walsh, Department of Enhanced Human Studies. I was hoping we could talk." Elena had never heard of the Department of Enhanced Human Studies, but given the federal government's talent for creating new agencies to handle unprecedented situations, its existence didn't surprise her. What did surprise her was Director Walsh's obvious nervousness, not the anxiety of someone planning to cause trouble, but the uncertainty of someone who understood they were dealing with forces beyond their control or comprehension. "Enhanced Human Studies," Matthew repeated thoughtfully. "That's a new one. What can we do for you, Director?" "Actually," Walsh replied, "we're hoping to figure out what we can do for you. And for others like your children." Grace looked up from her conversation with the tomato plants, her blue eyes focusing on Walsh with that uncanny intensity that still made adults nervous. "Others like us? We've been monitoring unusual phenomena worldwide," Walsh explained. "Children exhibiting extraordinary abilities, unexplained technological breakthroughs in communities with no apparent resources for such developments, regions where conflict resolution occurs through methods that shouldn't work but consistently do." Sam joined them from his workshop, wiping greasy hands on a towel that cleaned itself when he touched it. "How many others?" 17 confirmed cases in the past year alone. Children with abilities similar to yours, appearing in locations as diverse as rural Bangladesh, urban Detroit, and the Australian outback. All of them seem to be catalyzing positive changes in their communities. All of them are being raised by people who found them under unusual circumstances. Elena felt the implications hit her like a physical blow. "You're saying there are more children like Grace, Sam, and Hope? More products of the Meridian Research Program?" "That's what we thought initially," Walsh admitted. "But our investigation suggests something different. These children aren't products of genetic enhancement. They're something new entirely, a spontaneous evolutionary development that's occurring simultaneously across the planet." Hope smiled, continuing her work with the tomato plants while the adults grappled with concepts that challenged everything they thought they knew about human development. "Not new," she corrected gently. "Just ready. The world needed us, so we came." "From where?" Elena asked, though she suspected the answer would be impossible to document scientifically. "From love," Grace replied simply. "From the places where people care so much about making things better that they create space for impossible things to become possible." Director Walsh pulled out a tablet and showed them a map dotted with glowing points scattered across every continent. "Each of these locations represents a child like yours. Each one is surrounded by expanding circles of positive change, improved agriculture, innovative technology, peaceful conflict resolution, enhanced educational outcomes. And each one, Sam added, studying the pattern with the intensity of someone. Reading a familiar language is connected to all the others. We can feel them sometimes when we're really quiet and really focused, like distant stars in the same constellation. The revelation that Grace, Sam, and Hope were part of a global phenomena rather than unique individuals, created by a rogue scientific program, shifted Elena's entire understanding of what she was documenting. These weren't isolated miracles or products of human manipulation. They were evidence of something fundamental changing in the nature of consciousness itself. "What does your department want from us?" Matthew asked, his protective instincts clearly activated despite the visitor's peaceful intentions. "Communication," Walsh replied. "Coordination. We're trying to understand if these children are connected in ways that could benefit everyone. Whether they're unconsciously collaborating on solutions to global problems. Whether they represent humanity's natural response to existential challenges." Grace exchanged glances with her siblings, one of those wordless communications that had become common in their household. After a moment of silent consultation, she turned to Director Walsh with an expression that seemed far too adult for her young face. "We'll help," she said simply, "but not because you're asking us to. Because helping is what we do." "What would that look like?" Walsh asked. "Video calls," Hope suggested. "Like the ones I do with the UN people, but with the other children. Let us talk to each other directly instead of through adults who don't always understand what we're really saying." Sam nodded enthusiastically. "We could share projects, compare solutions, work on bigger problems together. Like a global classroom, but for fixing things instead of just learning about them." Elena watched Director Walsh's expression cycle through amazement, concern, and something that might have been hope. The idea of 17 extraordinarily gifted children collaborating on global problem-solving was either humanity's greatest opportunity or its most terrifying risk. "There would have to be security protocols," Walsh said carefully. "Oversight to ensure that—" "No," Grace interrupted firmly. "No oversight. No security protocols. No adults deciding what we can and can't talk about. We'll communicate directly, honestly, and without interference. That's the only way it works. These children could be discussing matters of international security, economic policy, technological developments that could reshape civilization itself," Walsh protested. "Exactly," Hope replied with a smile that was both innocent and deeply knowing, "which is why adult oversight would only make things worse. Adults create problems by trying to control things that work better when they're allowed to develop naturally." The afternoon dissolved into detailed discussions about communication methods, meeting schedules, and the logistics of connecting children across multiple time zones and cultural contexts. Elena found herself documenting conversations that would have seemed like science fiction 6 months ago, but now felt like inevitable steps in human development. As evening approached and Director Walsh's team prepared to leave, Elena realized that her role as an objective scientific observer had fundamentally changed. She was no longer studying extraordinary children. She was witnessing the emergence of a new phase in human evolution, one that prioritized connection over competition and collaboration over control. "Dr. Vasquez," Grace said as Elena packed her equipment, "you're going to write about us, aren't you?" "I have to," Elena replied. "The scientific community needs to understand what's happening here. Just remember," Sam added, "that the most important things can't be measured with instruments. Love doesn't show up on electromagnetic readings. Hope doesn't register on brain scans. But they're the most real things there are." Hope looked up from the tomato plants, which had somehow rearranged themselves into a perfect spiral pattern while the adults weren't paying attention. "And remember that we're not the miracle," she said quietly. "The miracle is that people like Matthew exist, people who are willing to love something impossible until it becomes possible. That night, as Alina reviewed her notes in the guest room that Sarah Hendricks had insisted she use, she realized that her documentation of Grace, Sam, and Hope would become part of something much larger than a single scientific study. She was recording the early chapters of humanity's transition into something unprecedented, a species that had learned to nurture its most extraordinary members instead of fearing them. Outside her window, the sounds of 3 children playing in the evening air mixed with the whisper of wind through crops that grew too well and the distant lowing of cattle that produced milk with properties that conventional science couldn't explain. Tomorrow, Grace would have her first video call with a boy in Bangladesh who could make monsoon rains fall exactly where they were needed most. Sam would collaborate with a girl in Detroit who had solved the city's water crisis using principles that seemed to violate thermodynamics. Hope would facilitate a discussion between children in Australia and Nigeria who had discovered that emotional intelligence could be taught through methods that made conflict resolution instinctive rather than learned, and Elena would document it all, knowing that she was recording evidence of the moment when humanity stopped limiting itself to what seemed reasonable and started embracing what was actually possible. 10 years after the first global communication between the enhanced children, the world had become a place that previous generations would have dismissed as impossible fantasy. Standing in what was once the United Nations headquarters in New York, now redesigned as the Global Collaboration Center, 18-year-old Grace Castellanos prepared to address humanity for what she knew would be the last time as part of the original 17. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had unfolded gradually, organically, as 17 extraordinary children, scattered across the globe, had grown into young adults who approached problems with solutions that seemed obvious only after they worked. Drought in Africa ended when children there taught farmers to read soil emotions and plant accordingly. Urban pollution disappeared when young minds in industrial cities designed filtration systems that turned waste into energy that fed back into natural cycles. International conflicts became obsolete when diplomatic children demonstrated that every human dispute stemmed from the same fundamental misunderstandings about scarcity and connection. Now at 18, the 17 were preparing to step back from active intervention in world affairs, not because their work was finished, but because humanity had finally learned to solve its own problems using principles the children had patiently taught through years of quiet demonstration. Today marks the completion of the transition period, Grace announced to the global audience gathered both physically and virtually. Her voice carried the same clarity it had possessed since she was 6 months old, but now it held the weight of someone who had helped reshape civilization through love disguised as practical solutions. In the audience, Matthew Castellanos, now 52, and serving as Director of Sustainable Community Development for the Global Collaboration Center, watched his daughter with pride that still felt like wonder after all these years. Beside him sat Sam and Hope, no longer the babies he'd found in a wooden crate, but young adults whose abilities had matured into tools for healing a world that had forgotten how to heal itself. Sam had become something unprecedented, an engineer whose designs worked not because they followed known scientific principles, but because they honored the inherent intelligence present in all materials. His latest project, a global energy grid that drew power from the planet's natural electromagnetic field, was coming online that very week, promising to end energy scarcity forever, while actually strengthening the Earth's natural systems. Hope had evolved into something that previous generations might have called a prophet, though she preferred the title pattern reader. She could perceive the underlying emotional currents that drove all human behavior and guide people toward choices that served both individual needs and collective well-being. Under her influence, the concept of national borders had gradually dissolved into something more fluid: cultural regions that celebrated differences while cooperating on challenges that affected everyone. For 10 years, Grace continued 17 children like me have served as bridges between what humanity was and what it could become. We've demonstrated that scarcity is an illusion created by systems that forgot to account for love. We've shown that conflict resolution becomes simple when you understand that everyone wants the same basic things. We've proven that technology works best when it honors the intelligence already present in nature. Dr. Elena Vasquez, now Director of Evolutionary Studies at the Global Research Institute, was recording Grace's speech for archives that would help future generations understand how the Great Transition had occurred. Her research had documented the emergence of what historians were already calling Homo sapiens collaboratus, a subspecies characterized not by physical differences, but by enhanced capacity for connection, empathy, and systemic thinking. But our work as teachers is complete, Grace announced. Because you've learned the most important lesson, you don't need us anymore. The statement sent a ripple of concern through the gathered audience. For 10 years, the 17 had been humanity's guides through challenges that had seemed insurmountable. Climate change had been reversed through collaborative environmental restoration projects. Economic inequality had evaporated when communities learned to share resources based on actual need rather than artificial scarcity. War had become obsolete. When populations discovered that cooperation produced better outcomes than competition. Sam stepped forward to address the crowd's unspoken fears. "We're not disappearing," he said with the gentle humor that had always characterized his approach to serious subjects. "We're just transitioning from teachers to participants. The extraordinary abilities we were born with, they're not unique anymore. Over the past decade, children born worldwide have been displaying similar capabilities. The evolutionary leap we represented is becoming humanity's new normal." It was true. Reports from every continent documented babies who spoke earlier, understood concepts faster, and demonstrated intuitive problem-solving abilities that previous generations would have considered supernatural. The transformation the 17 had catalyzed was spreading through natural reproduction, creating a generation that approached challenges with the same collaborative mindset that had reshaped civilization. Hope moved to the podium with the graceful confidence of someone who had spent years helping world leaders remember their better angels. "The age of heroes is ending," she said simply, "because we've entered the age of everyone." In the Texas ranch house that had become a pilgrimage site for people seeking to understand how love could transform impossibility into inevitability, Rebecca Tompkins' presence stirred in ways that only the most sensitive observers could detect. Her sacrifice designed to protect 3 babies who would help save a world had rippled outward through decades of quiet influence, touching every life that Grace, Sam, and Hope had encountered. The woman who had written "Please don't let them end up in the system like I did" would have been amazed to see that her children had eliminated the systems that created orphaned, abandoned, and forgotten people. Under their influence, every child born anywhere on Earth was considered the collective responsibility of all adults, ensuring that no one ever again had to choose between personal safety and protecting the innocent. "Our final gift," Grace said, her voice carrying across continents through translation systems that had been designed by children who understood that communication barriers existed only when people forgot they were fundamentally the same, "is the knowledge that you've always had everything you needed to create the world you wanted. You just needed permission to believe it was possible." Matthew felt tears he hadn't expected gathering in his eyes. The man who had once measured his worth by acres owned and cattle counted now understood that his greatest achievement had been remaining open to love when love appeared in its most unlikely form. 3 dying babies in a wooden crate had taught him that the most important things in life couldn't be measured, couldn't be owned, and couldn't be lost as long as someone was willing to nurture them. As Grace concluded her address and the global audience began to disperse, the 17 young adults who had guided humanity through its most crucial transition gathered for their own private farewell. They had been connected since birth by forces that science was still learning to measure, but they had also been separated by continents and cultures that gave each of them unique perspectives on universal challenges. Now, as they prepared to return to lives that would be extraordinary in their ordinariness, they shared a moment of recognition for what they had accomplished together without ever physically meeting until this day. "Not bad for a bunch of lab experiments," joked Kaya, the girl from Bangladesh who had taught monsoons to fall precisely where they were needed. "We were never lab experiments," corrected David, the boy from Detroit whose water purification systems had been copied in every major city worldwide. "We were love letters. From parents who died protecting us to a world that needed to remember how to protect everyone." Grace nodded, feeling the truth of that statement settle into her bones. They hadn't been created by genetic manipulation or enhanced through technological intervention. They had been called into existence by the accumulated need of people who loved so deeply that they inadvertently activated evolutionary possibilities that had always been dormant in human DNA. As the 17 dispersed to lives that would be filled with normal joys and normal challenges, falling in love, raising families, pursuing careers that interested them rather than saved civilizations, Grace felt Rebecca's presence one final time. A whisper of wildflower perfume, a touch of maternal approval, a sense of mission completed with grace and gratitude. Back at the ranch that evening, Matthew sat on his porch watching Sam teach his own children, normal, extraordinary human children, how to build toys that worked better when they were made with love than when they were engineered with precision. Hope was video calling her husband in Norway, planning a vacation that would be remarkable only for its complete unremarkableness. Grace was reading a novel, something she'd rarely had time for during the years when the world needed saving. "Any regrets?" Matthew asked his daughter. Grace considered the question while watching stars that seemed no brighter than usual, because extraordinary had become ordinary, and ordinary had become sacred. "Only one," she said finally. "I wish Mama could have seen what we became." "Who says she didn't?" Hope called from her video call, smiling with the knowing expression she'd worn since she was 6 months old. "Love doesn't end just because bodies do. It just changes shape and finds new ways to keep working." In the distance, thunder rumbled. Despite clear skies and the scent of wildflowers drifted on a breeze that carried with it the contentment of work well done. Somewhere in the space between what was and what could be, Rebecca Tompkins smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had bet everything on love and watched love transform the world. The wooden crate that had started it all sat in the ranch house museum that Matthew had never intended to create, surrounded by artifacts from the years when impossible things happened daily. But the real miracle wasn't preserved in any display case. It lived in the laughter of children who would never know scarcity, the cooperation of adults who had forgotten how to make enemies, and the quiet confidence of a species that had finally learned to trust its own capacity for goodness. 3 babies had been saved by a man who thought he was beyond saving. In return, they had saved a world that thought it was beyond hope. And in the end, both discoveries turned out to be the same truth. Love transforms everything it touches, but only when someone is brave enough to reach out and touch it back. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.